He had everything money could buy, but lived surrounded by an emptiness that not even his mansions could fill, until a simple gesture from a stranger reignited his hope in humanity. In that moment, he realized that true luxury is being seen with the heart. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. Let's continue. I promise this will be the best story you will hear in your life. The lights of New York City shone as they always did, tireless, reflecting off the mirrored glass of the tallest commercial building on Park Avenue. On the top floor, inside an office that looked more like a modern art gallery, Richard Miller watched the city below with the empty eyes of a man who had seen it all, conquered it all, and yet felt absolutely nothing. At 42, he was the owner of a tech empire that crossed borders, with companies on 5 continents and a fortune that financial journalists tried to calculate without ever getting the exact figure. He had mansions in Miami, Paris, and Tokyo, in addition to the triplex penthouse on the Upper East Side where he rarely slept. His name was synonymous with success, with realized ambition, with the American dream made real. But Richard Miller, the man behind the numbers, was completely shattered inside. 3 years had passed since that night, 3 years since his world had collapsed like a house of cards in a cruel gust of wind. 3 years since he discovered who Jessica really was. Her name still burned in his mind like a branding iron, bringing with it a mix of anger, disappointment, and a sadness so deep it seemed bottomless. He had loved her, truly loved her, with all the intensity a pragmatic and controlling man like him was capable of feeling. Jessica had been the exception in his calculated life, the only person who seemed to see him beyond the zeros in his bank account, beyond the last name that opened doors and intimidated rivals. Or at least that's what he had believed. The discovery happened by chance, as it always does in the worst tragedies. Richard was returning from a business trip in London when he decided to surprise her, arriving a day earlier than planned. He wanted to see her, hold her, tell her about the multi-million-dollar deal he had just closed that would guarantee his company's definitive expansion in Europe. On the way from the airport to her apartment, he mentally rehearsed his words, imagined the joyful expression on Jessica's face, dreamed of the future they would build together. They had even set a wedding date for 3 months from then. Everything was planned, organized, perfect. But when he opened the door using the key she had given him as a symbol of trust, he found the apartment empty. Jessica wasn't there. Her phone, however, was. Forgotten on the living room table, its screen lit up, showing an open conversation. Richard wasn't the type of man to invade someone's privacy, but something about the words on the screen made him stop. They were messages to someone identified only as Ryan, and the content was devastating. Jessica described her plan in detail, a plan so meticulously architected it seemed like a movie script. She was pregnant, but not with Richard's child. It was Ryan's, a man she had met months before, and with whom she was having an affair. The plan was simple and cruel. She would marry Richard, pretend the baby was his, and after a few years, file for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. With Richard's fortune and American divorce laws, she would secure astronomical alimony, financial security for the rest of her life, and still end up with Ryan, the man she truly loved. In the messages, she laughed at Richard's naivety, at how easy he was to manipulate, at how he believed everything she said. She called him a lovesick fool, an old sucker, a lucky idiot born with a silver spoon, who couldn't recognize a gold digger when he saw one. Richard read every word of that conversation, feeling the floor disappear from under his feet. He read the previous messages, dating back months, and realized he had been deceived from the very beginning. Every one of Jessica's smiles was a lie. Every "I love you" was a calculation. Every gesture of affection was an investment. She had never loved him. Never. He was just a means to an end, a walking wallet, a lovesick fool who believed he had finally found someone who valued him for who he was, not what he had. When Jessica returned home that night, she found Richard sitting on the sofa, her phone in his hands. There were no shouts, no drama. There was only an icy silence as he stared at her with eyes she had never seen before. Empty, dead, extinguished eyes. He simply stood up, placed the phone on the table, and said in a low, cutting voice that she had 24 hours to get out of his life. He never wanted to see her again. He never spoke her name again. In the following days, Richard cancelled the wedding, cut all ties with Jessica, and plunged into a deafening silence. His closest employees noticed the change. The boss had always been serious and direct, but now there was something different. A new hardness, a coldness that went beyond professionalism. Richard Miller had become a machine. He worked 18 hours a day, closed deals with surgical precision, expanded his empire with ruthless efficiency, but he never smiled. He had no friends. He didn't interact with anyone beyond what was strictly necessary. The mansions around the world remained empty. The Upper East Side penthouse was just a place to sleep for a few hours before returning to the office, and the only company he accepted was that of endless meetings and the financial reports he studied obsessively. For 3 years, Richard lived like this, a ghost in his own life. On the outside, he was still the billionaire businessman, admired and envied. On the inside, he was a broken man who trusted no one, who saw the world through dark lenses, who believed that all people were driven solely by self-interest, and that genuine kindness was just a romantic illusion for naive fools. But on that Thursday morning, something changed. Richard woke up. In the middle of the night, in a cold sweat, his heart racing, from a nightmare where he was alone in an infinite desert, screaming for help, and no one could hear him. He got up, walked to his bedroom window, and watched the city begin to wake. The sun hadn't fully risen, but he could already see the movement in the streets, the first cars, people heading to work, living their ordinary, anonymous lives. And for the first time in 3 years, Richard asked himself a question that shook him to his core. Is there still real kindness in the world? Are there still people capable of doing good without expecting anything in return? Or was Jessica right, and was he just a naive idiot who believed in fairy tales? The question wouldn't leave his mind. All day, while he attended meetings, signed contracts, and made decisions that moved millions of dollars, Richard couldn't stop thinking about it. He had to know. He had to find out if humanity still had a chance, or if cynicism and selfishness had won for good. And then, during a particularly boring meeting about mergers and acquisitions, he had an idea. A crazy idea, unthinkable for someone in his position, but one that made perfect sense for someone who had nothing left to lose. That same night, Richard left his penthouse dressed in a way he hadn't dressed in his adult life. Old jeans he found at a thrift store, a faded t-shirt, worn-out sneakers, a beat-up baseball cap. No $200,000 Swiss watch. No designer glasses. Nothing that could identify him as Richard Miller, the billionaire. He looked in the mirror and saw an ordinary, anonymous, invisible man. That was exactly what he wanted. He wanted to be a nobody. He wanted to walk among people without being recognized, without being fawned over, without being desired for his money. He wanted to see what people were really like when they had nothing to gain. He left the building through a service door he rarely used, dismissed the driver who was already waiting with the car, and started walking the streets of New York. He took the subway for the first time in over 20 years. He felt the crush of the crowd, the smell of sweat mixed with cheap perfume, overheard conversations about bills to pay, kids to raise, dreams deferred. It was a world completely different from his, but it was the real world, the world where most people lived. He got off at a station in Queens, in a neighborhood he had never visited. The streets were bustling, full of small shops, street vendors selling everything imaginable, kids playing on the sidewalks, women coming home from work with grocery bags. Richard walked aimlessly, observing everything with the eyes of someone seeing it for the first time. He passed a church, where a group of elderly people were chatting animatedly on the steps. He passed a diner where the smell of fresh coffee made him realize he was hungry. He passed a school where kids in uniforms ran out shouting, happy that classes were over. That's when he saw the diner. It was a simple place with formica tables, mismatched chairs, a menu handwritten on a chalkboard on the wall. Nothing like the Michelin-starred restaurants he frequented, where reservations were made months in advance, and the bill for one meal cost more than many people earned in a month. But it was exactly the kind of place he was looking for, a place where he would be just another guy, a place where no one would know who he was. He went in and sat at a table in the corner. The place was busy, full of workers having a meal before heading home. Richard waited, and waited, and kept waiting. 10 minutes passed, 15, 20. No one came to serve him. The waitresses walked past him as if he were invisible, carrying plates to other tables, chatting with other customers, laughing at jokes he couldn't hear. Richard began to feel something he hadn't felt in a long time: humiliation. He, who was used to being greeted with reverence wherever he went, was being completely ignored. Not because he was Richard Miller, the businessman, but precisely because he wasn't. He was just an ordinary man, dressed simply, sitting alone in a corner, and therefore irrelevant. Finally, a waitress approached, not with a welcoming smile, but with a bored, impatient expression. She placed a glass of water on the table with such carelessness that some of it spilled, and asked what he wanted in a dry, harsh tone. Richard looked at the menu, chose a simple dish, but before he could finish speaking, the waitress cut him off, saying they were out of that. She offered another option without any enthusiasm. Richard accepted, but she had already turned and walked away without even properly writing down the order. He sat there with his half-full glass of water, feeling smaller than ever. He looked around. The waitress who had treated him with such disdain was now at another table, smiling and attentive to a group of men who were making loud jokes and ordering beer. Richard realized it wasn't a matter of the diner being busy or her having a bad day. It was a matter of who he appeared to be. A man, alone, poorly dressed, apparently without money, didn't deserve attention, didn't deserve respect. He was invisible. The realization hurt more than he expected. For all these years, he had believed the problem was with the people around him, that they were self-serving and fake. But now he realized the problem was systemic. People were kind and attentive to those who could bring them some benefit, and cruel or indifferent to those who couldn't. Maybe Jessica was right. Maybe the world really was like this. Maybe selfless kindness was just a fantasy. That's when they walked in. Richard noticed them immediately, not because they were flashy, but for the exact opposite reason. A young woman appearing to be in her 30s, and a little girl no older than 7 or 8. They both wore simple but clean and well-cared-for clothes. The girl's hair was in 2 braids, and she carried a school backpack. The mother held her hand tenderly as she looked for an empty table. They sat 2 tables away from Richard. The same waitress who had ignored him approached them immediately, but this time with a genuine smile. She greeted the woman by name, Sarah, and gently patted the girl's head, calling her Emily. They chatted for a few minutes with a familiar ease like old acquaintances. Richard realized they were regulars, that they had a relationship of respect and affection with the people who worked there. Sarah picked up the menu and studied it carefully. Emily pointed excitedly to a specific dish, but her mother gently shook her head, showing her another item on the menu. Richard watched the scene with curiosity. Finally, Sarah closed the menu and placed their order, a single dish, just one, to share with her daughter. The waitress made no comment, just smiled with understanding and wrote it down. Richard understood immediately. They didn't have enough money to order 2 meals. They were there to share a single meal, to make it last, to satisfy their hunger with the little they could afford. The plate arrived quickly. The waitress placed it on the table carefully, along with 2 forks, and wished them a good meal with sincerity. Sarah thanked her, divided the food equally onto 2 smaller plates she had asked for, and began to eat slowly, savoring each bite. Emily did the same, but her childish eyes wandered around the diner, watching the other tables, the other families, the movement of the people. That's when the girl's gaze met Richard's. She watched him for a moment, with the innocent curiosity of children, and then looked at the empty water glass in front of him. No plate, no food, just a man sitting alone, with nothing but an empty glass. Emily tugged on her mother's sleeve and whispered something. Sarah looked up and followed her daughter's gaze to Richard. Their eyes met. Richard saw something in that woman's eyes he hadn't seen in a long time. It wasn't pity. It wasn't judgment. It was empathy, a recognition of a shared pain, of an understood loneliness. Sarah hesitated for a moment, as if fighting an internal battle, weighing her options, considering the consequences. Then slowly, she stood up from her chair. She picked up the plate in front of her, still with more than half the food on it, and walked over to Richard's table. He watched her approach, not understanding what was happening. When she stopped beside his table, Richard felt his heart race in a strange way. Sarah smiled. It was a shy but genuine smile, and then, in a soft voice, she said something that would shake him to his core. "Sir, are you hungry? My daughter and I would like to share our food with you, if you want, of course. There's no need to be embarrassed." Richard was frozen. He looked at the woman. He looked at the plate of food in her hand. He looked at the little girl sitting at the table, watching him with a sweet, encouraging smile. They barely had enough for themselves. They had ordered a single plate to share between the two of them, and yet they were offering part of it to a stranger, to him. A man they had never seen before, who meant nothing to them, who couldn't possibly repay them. Richard's throat tightened. He felt his eyes burn. He couldn't speak. It had been 3 years since he had felt anything resembling a real emotion, and now here he was, sitting in a cheap diner in Queens, about to cry over a simple gesture from a woman he barely knew. Sarah interpreted his silence as hesitation and gently placed the plate on his table. "Please, help yourself," she said delicately. "We all need a little help sometimes. It's okay." And then she returned to her table, sat next to her daughter, and the two of them continued sharing the small portion that was left, as if they had just done the most natural thing in the world. Richard looked at the plate in front of him. Simple food, chicken, rice, and a side of vegetables. Nothing fancy, nothing expensive. But it was the most beautiful gesture anyone had made for him in years. Maybe in his entire life. He picked up the fork with trembling hands and brought the first bite to his mouth. But it wasn't the food that nourished him. It was hope. The hope that maybe, just maybe, there was still real kindness in the world, that not all people were like Jessica, that there were still those who did good without expecting a reward, without calculating advantages, without measuring benefits. He ate slowly, savoring not the food, but the meaning of that moment. He watched Sarah and Emily talking quietly, laughing at something the girl was telling her about school. He saw the love between them, the bond, the simplicity of a true relationship, and he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Envy. Not of wealth, because he had more money than he could ever spend, but envy of that human connection, of that sense of belonging, of that genuine happiness that didn't depend on bank figures or social status. When he finished eating, Richard got up and went to the counter to pay his bill. That's when he received the second surprise of the night. The cashier looked at him, confused, and said his bill had already been paid. "The lady at that table over there, she included your meal with hers. It's all taken care of." Richard turned and looked at Sarah, who was avoiding his gaze as she helped Emily put on her backpack. She hadn't just shared her food with him, she had paid for him too. With the little she had, with the carefully counted money that would surely be missed in her tight budget, she had included his bill. Something broke inside Richard at that moment. All the barriers he had built over 3 years, all the defenses, all the cynicism, all the resentment, it all came crashing down at once. He left the diner before Sarah and Emily, needing fresh air, needing to process what had just happened. He leaned against the wall outside, feeling his legs weak, his chest tight, his eyes finally filling with tears he hadn't shed in a long time. They came out a few minutes later. Richard watched them from a distance, still trying to regain his composure. Sarah held Emily's hand, and the two walked down the street illuminated by the lampposts, chatting animatedly. Without thinking, without planning, moved by an impulse he didn't even understand himself, Richard began to follow them. He kept his distance, careful not to be seen, just wanting to know where they were going, where they lived, who these people were who had just changed something fundamental inside him. They walked for about 15 minutes until they reached an even more humble neighborhood, The streets were narrower, the houses simpler, but everything was impeccably clean and cared for. Sarah stopped in front of a small house with a faded green gate and a tiny but well-tended garden. Colourful flowers adorned the flower beds. An old-fashioned lamp hung over the front door. It was a modest house, but there was something about it that conveyed warmth, home, belonging. Richard watched as they went inside. The living room light came on, and through the thin curtain he could see their silhouettes moving inside. Emily hung up her backpack. Sarah went to the kitchen. A normal life, a simple life, a real life. He stood there for a few more minutes, memorizing the address, taking in every detail. Then finally he turned and walked back to the subway station. During the entire ride back to his penthouse on the Upper East Side, he couldn't stop thinking about them, about Sarah, who, despite having so little, had offered what she had without hesitation. About Emily, who with innocent eyes had seen the hungry man and immediately wanted to help. About a simple life full of love, in contrast to his luxurious but completely empty life. When he got home that night, Richard didn't go straight to bed, as he always did. He sat on the penthouse balcony, overlooking the infinite city of lights, and for the first time in 3 years he allowed himself to feel gratitude, to feel hope, to feel that maybe, just maybe, there was a way back to the humanity he had lost. And it was all because of a woman and a little girl, who didn't even know who he was, but who had shown him something all his billions could never buy: true kindness. The following days were strange for Richard. He returned to his usual routine, the endless meetings, the multi-million-dollar contracts, the decisions that affected thousands of employees around the world. But something had changed, something fundamental. While signing documents or listening to presentations on financial projections, his mind constantly drifted back to that house with the green gate, to the woman with the shy smile, and to the little girl with braids who had shown him something he thought no longer existed. For a whole week, Richard fought with himself. Part of him said he should forget the incident, that it was just an isolated moment, an exception in a world still governed by selfishness. But another part, a part that was waking up after 3 years of dormancy, couldn't stop thinking about them. He wanted to see them again. He needed to understand who they were, how they lived, what made them capable of such generosity in such a cruel world. It was on a Friday afternoon when he left the office early for the first time in years that Richard made his decision. He changed back into the simple clothes, dismissed his driver, and took the subway back to Queens. His heart pounded the whole way, like a teenager on a first date. He didn't know exactly what he would do when he got there. He didn't have a plan. He just knew he had to go back. He got off at the same station, retraced the path Sarah and Emily had taken, and stopped in front of the house with the green gate. Now, in the daylight, he could see the details better. The faded paint on the exterior walls, the simple bars on the windows, the clothesline in the yard where a few items were drying in the sun. It was so different from everything he knew, yet something about the place drew him in, a sense of home that his mansions never had. He took a deep breath and rang the doorbell. He heard footsteps approaching from inside. When the door opened, Sarah was there, wearing an apron with paint stains on her hands, her hair in a messy bun. It took her a few seconds to recognize him, and when she did, her eyes widened in surprise. "You," she said, not finishing the sentence, clearly confused about what he was doing there. Richard suddenly felt inadequate, like an intruder, out of place. "I'm sorry to show up like this, unannounced," he began, searching for the right words. "I just wanted to thank you in person for what you did for me at the diner. It meant more than you can possibly imagine." Sarah watched him with a mix of surprise and caution. Richard realized she was suspicious, and she had every right to be. A stranger showing up at her door unannounced wasn't exactly reassuring. But before Sarah could respond, a cheerful little voice called from inside. "Mum, who is it? Is it the man from the diner?" Emily came running out, still in her school uniform, and her face lit up when she saw Richard. "Hi," she said, with the naturalness of a child. "You came to visit us? That's awesome." Emily's innocence broke the tension. Sarah sighed, relaxed her shoulders, and offered a small but genuine smile. "Sorry for being suspicious," she said. "It's just not every day we get visitors we barely know, but since you're here, would you like to come in?" Richard accepted, feeling immense gratitude for this second chance. The house was even cozier on the inside. The living room was small, with an old but comfortable sofa, an old TV, and a few potted plants scattered around. The walls were decorated with Emily's crayon drawings taped up. There was a bookshelf with used books and a few picture frames with photos of the two of them at different times. Everything was simple, but everything was full of life, memories, and love. Sarah offered him a coffee and Richard accepted. He sat on the sofa while she went to the kitchen. Emily sat next to him, swinging her little legs, and started asking 1,000 questions with that innocent curiosity of children. "Where do you live? Why were you alone at the diner? Do you have kids? Do you like to draw?" Richard answered each question patiently, feeling a strange and pleasant warmth in his chest. It had been so long since he'd had a simple, genuine conversation with someone. Sarah returned with the coffee and some homemade cookies on a plate. She sat in the armchair across from Richard and watched him attentively. He could tell she was trying to understand him, to figure him out. Finally, Sarah spoke. "Can I ask you something personal?" Richard nodded. "You seemed lost that day at the diner. Not just hungry, but lost. Did something happen?" The directness of the question completely disarmed Richard. He could have made up a story, but something about this woman made him want to be honest. He could have lied and said he was just going through some temporary financial trouble, but he couldn't. Instead, he decided to tell a condensed version of the truth. He said he had gone through a profound disappointment a few years ago, that he had lost faith in people, that he was testing to see if kindness still existed in the world, and that she and Emily had shown him that yes, it still did. Sarah listened in silence, and when he finished, her eyes were misty. "We've all been hurt by someone at some point," she said softly. "I've been through hard times too, but I've learned that you can't let the badness of a few people turn you into a bad person. If you do that, they win. The only way to beat the darkness is to keep being a light even when it hurts." Sarah's words hit Richard hard. That was exactly what he had done. He had let Jessica's cruelty turn him into someone cold, distant, incapable of trust. He had let her win. But now, sitting in that simple living room, listening to this wise woman, he began to understand that there was still time to change. They talked for hours. Sarah told him her story, and Richard learned that she had started working very young at 14 when her mother got sick and could no longer support the family. She dropped out of school to work as a housekeeper, cleaning, cooking, and taking care of other people's children, while dreaming of having her own. At 20, she met Emily's father. He was handsome, charming, full of promises. They swore eternal love. They married in a simple ceremony. Sarah got pregnant soon after. Everything seemed perfect until the day Emily was born. That's when the spell broke and reality hit, raw and painful. Sarah's husband wasn't ready to be a father. He didn't want the responsibility, the sleepless nights, the diapers to change, the life that no longer revolved solely around him. He started going out more and more, coming home later and later, making less and less convincing excuses, until one day he simply didn't come back. He left a note saying he wasn't cut out for that life, that he needed to be free, that they would be better off without him. Sarah was left alone with a 3-month-old baby, no steady job, no family to help, no support system. But Sarah didn't give up. She never gave up. She learned how to do nails by watching online videos, practiced on friends until she got good and started working as a manicurist in a small neighborhood salon. The money was tight, but it was enough to pay the rent on the simple house and buy the basics for her and Emily to survive. She raised her daughter alone, with dignity, with love, teaching her values that money couldn't buy. Empathy, generosity, kindness, the very things she had shown at the diner. Richard listened in silence, feeling a growing admiration for this woman. She had faced hardships he couldn't even imagine, and yet she hadn't become bitter or selfish. On the contrary, she remained generous, she remained a light, as she herself had said. She was the opposite of him, who had everything and had chosen to shut himself off from the world because of a single betrayal. When Sarah finished her story, Richard found himself doing something he hadn't planned. He started telling his own story. He didn't lie, didn't omit, didn't try to impress. He told her about the empire he had built, the loneliness he felt, about Jessica and the devastating betrayal, about the 3 years of an empty life. Sarah listened without judgment, only with understanding in her eyes. When he finished, she reached out and lightly touched his arm. "I'm so sorry for what you went through," she said. "But you know what I think? I think that woman did you a favor. She showed you who she really was before it was too late. Now you have a chance to start over, to find someone who will love you for real, not for what you have, but for who you are." Sarah's words touched something deep in Richard. She was right. Jessica had done him a favor, albeit a cruel one. But now he was here, sitting in this humble house, talking with an extraordinary woman and her charming daughter, feeling more alive than he had in years. Emily, who had been drawing in a corner during part of the conversation, came over and showed her drawing to Richard. It was a house, a sun, and 3 stick figures holding hands. "This is you," she said, pointing to one of the figures. "You're with us in our house." Richard felt his eyes burn again. This child barely knew him, but she had already included him in her world, in her drawing, in her life. It was in that moment that Richard had an idea that came from the heart, not the head. An idea that just a few days ago he would have considered absurd, but that now made all the sense in the world. "Sarah," he said, hesitating, "have you ever thought about having your own business, your own salon?" Sarah laughed sadly. "I think about it every day," she replied. "It's my dream. But dreams don't pay the bills, and I can barely scrape together enough for our monthly expenses. Opening a salon requires an investment I'll never be able to make." "What if you had a partner?" Richard asked. "Someone who believed in you, who could provide the startup capital, and who would split the profits fairly." Sarah looked at him suspiciously. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about a partnership," Richard replied. "I'll put up the money to rent a space, renovate it, buy the equipment. You'll bring the talent, the knowledge, the hard work. We split the profits 50-50. No catches, no fine print. An honest partnership." Sarah was silent for a long moment. Richard could see the conflict in her eyes, the natural suspicion of someone who had been deceived before, fighting against the desperate desire to believe that this opportunity was real. "Why would you do that?" she finally asked. "Why would a stranger offer something like this?" "Because you gave me back something I thought I had lost forever," Richard answered sincerely. "Hope, faith in humanity. And because I believe you deserve the chance to make your dream come true. You're a hard worker, you're talented, you're honest. You deserve more than what life has given you so far." Sarah remained hesitant, but Richard saw a spark of hope light up in her eyes. Emily, who had overheard the whole conversation, jumped up excitedly. "Mum, you're going to have your own salon. It's going to be the most beautiful salon ever." Sarah looked at her daughter, then at Richard, and finally allowed herself to smile. "Okay," she said, "but on one condition. If this doesn't work out, if the salon doesn't succeed, I'll pay back every penny you invest. I don't want to owe anyone anything." Richard agreed, knowing that condition was important for Sarah's dignity. They shook hands, sealing a deal that would change both of their lives forever. Emily clapped enthusiastically, and in that moment Richard felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Purpose. He wasn't doing this to expand his empire or make more money. He was doing it because it was the right thing to do, because these 2 people had touched his heart in a way nothing else ever had. In the following weeks, Richard and Sarah started looking for a suitable commercial space. Richard insisted on using only her name on the lease, so she would officially be the owner. They found a small but well-located spot on a busy neighborhood street with plenty of foot traffic. The place had been abandoned for months and needed a complete overhaul, but it had potential. Richard hired a team of contractors and painters, but he didn't just pay the bills. To everyone's surprise, including his own, he started showing up at the site during the renovations. At first, he just supervised, but gradually he started getting his hands dirty. He helped paint walls, install shelves, and clear out debris. He got his hands dirty, he sweated, he got tired, and he felt a satisfaction he had never felt closing multi-million-dollar deals in air-conditioned boardrooms. Sarah worked alongside him, equally determined. She chose every detail with care, from the color of the walls to the potted plants that would make the space more welcoming. Emily would visit them after school, helping in any way she could, handing out water to the workers, sweeping up sawdust, and filling the place with her crystal-clear laughter. During this process, Richard became a part of their lives in a natural, gradual way. He would pick them up in the morning before heading to the renovation site and drive them home at the end of the day. He started helping Emily with her homework, discovering he had the patience to explain math in a way that made the girl's eyes light up with understanding. He fixed the leaky faucet in Sarah's kitchen, changed the burnt-out light bulb in Emily's room, and painted the faded green gate. They started having dinner together frequently, simple meals prepared by Sarah, but they had a taste Richard had never experienced before, the taste of belonging, of family, of home. Emily would tell stories from school, doing funny impressions of her teachers. Sarah would laugh, relaxed and happy in a way Richard could tell was rare. And he, the billionaire businessman accustomed to dinners at Michelin-starred restaurants, felt more satisfied sharing rice and beans at that simple table than he ever had at any lavish banquet. At night, after Emily was asleep, Richard and Sarah would talk in the small living room. They shared stories, dreams, fears, and hopes. Sarah told him about the struggles of raising a daughter alone, about the nights she cried in secret so Emily wouldn't see, about the constant fear of not being enough. Richard talked about the loneliness he had felt for years, about how he had allowed one betrayal to turn him into someone he didn't even recognize, about how being there with them was changing him in ways he couldn't fully express. A silent but profound connection was forming between them. It wasn't just physical attraction, although Richard couldn't deny that Sarah was beautiful, with her simple yet elegant way, her expressive eyes, her smile that lit up the room. It was something deeper. It was mutual recognition. Two people wounded by life, two souls who had faced darkness, finding light in each other. Emily, with the sharp perception of children, noticed the change. She started calling Richard Uncle Rich and then, shyly, just Rich. He loved the nickname, loved the intimacy it represented. When the girl ran to hug him when he arrived, when she took his hand to show him something from school, when she fell asleep on the sofa during a movie and he carefully carried her to bed, Richard felt his heart expand in a way he didn't know was possible. The salon renovations were almost complete. The place had been completely transformed. Bright, cheerful walls, large, well-lit mirrors, comfortable chairs, simple but cozy decor. Sarah had chosen the name with care, New Beginnings Salon, a name that symbolized not just the start of the business, but the restart of her own life, and also, Richard thought, his own rebirth. The night before the grand opening, the three of them were at the salon making the final adjustments. Emily was drawing in a corner, Sarah was organizing products on the shelves, and Richard was assembling the last chairs. It was a domestic, simple, ordinary scene. But for Richard, it was extraordinary. It was real. It was real life, happening in real time, without filters, without masks, without games of self-interest. Sarah stopped what she was doing and looked around with tears in her eyes. "I can't believe this is really happening," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Richard. Thank you for believing in me when I didn't even believe in myself." Richard crossed the salon and stood beside her. "No," he said softly. "Thank you. You saved me, Sarah. You and Emily showed me that it's still worth believing, still worth trusting, still worth feeling. You gave me back my humanity." Their eyes met, and in that moment, something shifted between them. Something that had been growing silently over all those weeks, during all those conversations, during all those shared moments. It was no longer just friendship, no longer just a business partnership. It was something deeper, truer, more terrifying and more wonderful at the same time. Emily, sensing the moment, came over and hugged both of their legs. "Now we're a real family," she said, with the innocent wisdom of children. And in that simple sentence, in that sincere hug, In that salon that still smelled of fresh paint, the three of them felt that, yes, maybe they really were. The grand opening of New Beginning Salon took place on a sunny Saturday in September. Sarah woke up before sunrise, as anxious and excited as a child on Christmas morning. She got ready with special care, choosing a simple but beautiful dress she saved for important occasions. Emily was even more excited, bouncing around the house, helping her mom get ready, making 1,000 plans for the special day. Richard arrived early, bringing flowers to decorate the salon entrance and a cake he had ordered from a local bakery. When Sarah saw the flowers, her eyes filled with grateful tears. They were white daisies, simple but beautiful, and she hugged them as if they were the most precious gift in the world. To her they were. They opened the doors at 9 in the morning. Sarah was nervous, wringing her hands, afraid no one would show up, but her worries were unfounded. The first clients arrived just a few minutes later. They were neighbors, friends from the area, women who knew Sarah and wanted to support her. Then came others drawn by the flyers Emily had proudly distributed around the neighborhood in the preceding days, and by the beautiful sign Richard had commissioned. The salon quickly filled with life. Lively conversations, laughter, the sound of hairdryers, soft music playing in the background. Sarah worked with dedication and care, making each client feel special, listening to their stories, offering not just beauty services but also comfort and genuine attention. That was exactly what made her work different. She didn't see these women just as clients but as people, each with her own stories, her pains, her joys. Richard stayed at the salon all day, not as an owner or investor, but as a helper. He offered coffee and water to the clients, helped Emily keep everything organized, and chatted with the people waiting, making them feel welcome. No one there knew who he really was. To everyone, he was just Rich, Sarah's partner, the kind man who had helped make this dream a reality. Emily moved through the salon like a little hostess, showing off the drawings she had made to decorate the walls, offering candy to the children who came with their mothers, and filling the space with her contagious energy. The clients adored her, commenting on how polite and cheerful she was, and Sarah's chest swelled with pride. At the end of the day, when the last client had left and they locked the salon door, Sarah collapsed into one of the chairs, exhausted but radiant. "We did it," she said, almost in disbelief. "We really did it." Richard sat beside her, also tired but satisfied. "You did it," he corrected her. "This success is all yours, Sarah. Your talent, your warmth, your dedication. I just helped open the doors." Emily climbed into Richard's lap, yawning sleepily after the busy day. "This was the best day of my life," she murmured, resting her head on his chest. Richard felt something tighten in his heart. He wrapped his arms around the little girl, looked at Sarah, who was watching them with a tired but happy smile, and thought that maybe this had been the best day of his life, too. The following weeks confirmed that New Beginning Salon wasn't just an initial success. Clients returned, brought friends, and spread the word about the new salon in the neighborhood, where they felt welcomed and well cared for. Sarah had to hire 2 assistants to keep up with the demand. The business was thriving beyond all expectations. But the real success wasn't just in the numbers or the satisfied clients. It was in the transformation happening in the lives of the 3 of them. Sarah was more confident, happier, more fulfilled. For the first time in years, she felt in control of her own destiny, that she was building something solid for herself and Emily. The constant worry she had always carried on her shoulders had lessened. There were still challenges, of course, but now she faced the future with hope instead of fear. Emily was flourishing. With a more stable financial situation, Sarah could afford better school supplies, some new books, and clothes that weren't hand-me-downs or from a thrift store. But more importantly, the girl now had a father figure in her life. Richard wasn't officially her father, but he was taking on the role naturally. He picked her up from school when he could, helped with homework, attended school performances, fixed broken toys, and patiently listened to her endless stories about her adventures with friends. And Richard was completely transformed. The cold, distant man he had been for 3 years was gone. In his place was someone who smiled genuinely, who cared about real people, who found joy in simple things. He still ran his business empire, of course, but now with a different perspective. He had reorganized his priorities, delegated more responsibilities, and made time in his schedule for what truly mattered. His mornings no longer started in cold boardrooms, but with breakfast with Sarah and Emily. His evenings no longer ended at business dinners, but in conversations in the small living room, helping with homework and watching cartoons he once would have considered a waste of time. His employees noticed the change. The boss was different, more human, more approachable. He started asking about their families, taking a genuine interest in their lives outside of work. He implemented more flexible policies, increased benefits, and created support programs. The company didn't become less profitable because of it. On the contrary, with happier, more motivated employees, productivity increased. But not everything was perfect. There was a growing tension between Richard and Sarah that they both felt, but neither dared to name. The glances that lingered a little too long, the accidental touches that sent shivers down their skin, the late-night conversations that stretched on, because neither of them wanted them to end. There was something unsaid, hanging in the air between them, something that scared them both for different reasons. Sarah was afraid of falling in love again. Emily's father had taught her that love could be a cruel illusion, that people could promise forever and then disappear without a backward glance. Besides, Richard was from a completely different world. She knew that now, because he had finally told her the whole truth about who he was. It had been a difficult conversation, full of hesitation, with Richard fearing she would see him differently after learning of his fortune. But Sarah had just shaken her head and said it didn't matter how many zeros he had in his bank account. What mattered was who he was when he was there, with them, without masks, without pretense, and that person she already knew and deeply appreciated. Richard had his own fears. Jessica had destroyed his ability to trust. Even though he rationally knew Sarah was completely different, even seeing daily proof of her character and integrity, there was a part of him that was still afraid to let himself go again. Afraid of being deceived, used, hurt, afraid that everything he was feeling was just an illusion that would shatter to reveal a painful reality. But the heart has its reasons which reason knows nothing of, and what was growing between them was stronger than any fear. One night after Emily had gone to sleep, Richard and Sarah were in the living room as usual, but this time the silence was different, charged, expectant. Sarah looked at him and finally said what she had been feeling for weeks. "Richard, I need to tell you something, and I need you to be honest with me in return." He nodded, his heart racing. "I don't know how this happened," she continued, her voice trembling. "It wasn't my intention, but it happened. I've fallen in love with you completely, and it scares me so much, because I've been hurt before, because our worlds are so different, because I have a daughter to protect, but I can't pretend this isn't happening anymore." Richard was silent for a moment that felt like an eternity to Sarah. Then, slowly, he moved closer to her. He took her hands, and when he spoke, his voice was hoarse with emotion. "I've fallen in love with you too, Sarah. With you and with Emily. You saved me from myself. You showed me what really matters. You made me want to be a better man. Am I scared? Yes, I'm terrified of letting myself go and getting hurt again. But I'm even more scared of letting this love slip away out of cowardice." Their faces were close now. Sarah could feel his breath, warm and quick. Richard could see the glint in her eyes, tears of emotion about to fall. And then finally, inevitably, their lips met in a kiss that was both gentle and intense, hesitant and decisive, frightening and wonderful. When they pulled apart, both had tears in their eyes. Sarah rested her forehead against his. "What do we do now?" she asked. Richard smiled. "We live," he answered, simply. "We build this together, one day at a time, with no impossible promises, just the truth of what we feel right now." Sarah agreed, and they held each other for a long time, just feeling each other's presence, the connection they had built over months of living together, working together, deep conversations and shared moments. But life rarely allows happiness to be simple. A few days later, Richard had to travel for an important meeting in Manhattan. It was something he couldn't postpone, a crucial deal that required his personal presence. He promised to be back in 2 days. Sarah and Emily walked him to the subway station, saying goodbye with tight hugs. During the meeting, which took place in the luxurious Park Avenue office Richard hadn't visited in weeks, something unexpected happened. Jessica showed up. She had managed to get past security by claiming it was an urgent personal matter involving Richard. When he saw her walk into his office, he felt a mix of anger, surprise, and disgust. Jessica looked different, thinner, with deep, dark circles under her eyes, a disheveled appearance that contrasted with the always impeccable woman he had known. She closed the door behind her, and just stood there, unsure of where to begin. Richard crossed his arms and waited, refusing to make this encounter any easier for her. Finally, Jessica spoke. "I made a mistake," she said, her voice trembling. "The biggest mistake of my life. Ryan left me as soon as the money ran out. I found out he was with other women the whole time, that I was just another part of his scheme. I lost everything. I lost you. I lost my dignity. I lost my future." Richard listened without expressing any emotion. "And why did you come here?" he asked, coldly. "To ask for forgiveness? To ask for money? To try to convince me you're sorry?" Jessica started to cry. "I came to say that you were right about everything. That I was the gold digger, the schemer, the horrible person you found out I was. But I also came to say that all this time, in some twisted part of my mind, I believed I loved you in my own way. That maybe I could have both, love and money. I was foolish. I was cruel. And now I'm paying the price." Richard stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the city below. For 3 years he had imagined this moment. He had fantasized about Jessica coming back, repentant, begging for forgiveness, admitting her mistake. He had imagined different ways of reacting, from yelling to coldly forgiving her. But now that the moment was actually happening, he felt only indifference. This woman no longer had any power over him. That pain no longer existed. He turned to face her. "Jessica," he said calmly, "I forgive you. Not because you deserve it, but because I need to forgive to move on completely. You taught me valuable lessons, albeit brutally. You taught me not to trust blindly. You taught me that not all that glitters is gold. And ironically, you led me down a path that made me find something real. So thank you, in a twisted way. But now, I need you to leave and never come back." Jessica sobbed louder, but Richard remained firm. She tried to approach him, but he held up a hand, stopping her. "Just go," he said. "Rebuild your life away from me. Learn from your mistakes. Become a better person. But do it far away from here." Jessica finally understood that there was nothing left for her there. She nodded, wiped her tears, and left. Richard was left alone in his office, processing what had just happened, and he realized something extraordinary. He no longer felt anger. He no longer felt pain. He felt nothing for Jessica but a distant compassion for the broken person she had become. That encounter had been a test, he realized, a test for himself, and he had passed. He had faced his past, looked his pain in the eye, and had come out whole. More than whole, strengthened, because now he had something real to go back to. He had Sarah, he had Emily, he had a home. He immediately called Sarah, needing to hear her voice. When she answered, he simply said, "I'm coming home early tomorrow morning." And he realized that for the first time in his life, when he said home, he wasn't referring to a physical building but to people. Sarah was his home. Emily was his home. That little house with the green gate was more of a home than any of his mansions would ever be. Sarah heard something different in his voice and asked if everything was okay. Richard smiled. "Everything is perfect," he replied. "I love you, Sarah. I love you and Emily more than I thought I was capable of loving anything. And when I get back, we need to talk about our future, about building something permanent together." On the other end of the line, Sarah's heart overflowed. "I love you too," she whispered. "And yes, let's talk about everything. About us, about Emily, about how we're going to make this work. Because I want this too, Richard. I want you in my life, in our life, not as a visitor, but as not as an integral part of it." When Richard returned the next day, He was greeted with tight hugs and kisses full of longing. Emily jumped into his arms, shouting that she had missed him. Sarah kissed him with an intensity that spoke of love, commitment, and the future. And there, in that small living room, with the two people who had completely changed his life, Richard knew he had finally found where he belonged. But there was still one important conversation they needed to have. A decision Richard had made that would change everything for good. After Emily went to sleep that night, he asked Sarah to sit with him. He had something important to say, something he had been thinking about for weeks, but was now absolutely sure of. "Sarah," he began, taking her hands. "Over the past few months, you two have given me something I never had. A family, a home, a purpose that goes beyond making money or building empires. Emily calls me Uncle Rich, sometimes even just Rich, and it fills my heart. But I want more than that. I want to officially be part of this family." Sarah looked at him, tears beginning to form. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I want to recognize Emily as my daughter," Richard replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I want to give her my last name, legally adopt her as my daughter, give her everything a father should give. Love, protection, presence, a future. She may not have my blood, but she has my whole heart, and I want the whole world to officially know that." Sarah was crying openly now. "Richard, are you sure? That's a huge responsibility, a commitment for life." "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," he answered. "Emily is my daughter in every way that truly matters. And I want to be the father she deserves, if you'll let me, if she wants me to." Sarah threw herself into his arms, sobbing with happiness. "Of course I'll let you," she said through her tears. "Of course. You're already her father in all the ways that matter. This would just make official what already exists." They decided to talk to Emily the next day. It was important that the girl understood and agreed. When she woke up, she found Richard and Sarah sitting at the breakfast table with serious but also anxious expressions. Emily sensed something important was about to happen and sat between them, curious. Richard took a deep breath. "Emily, sweetie," he began, "you know I love you and your mum very much, right?" The girl nodded, her eyes wide. "I've been thinking a lot about our family, and I want to ask you a very important question. Would you like it if I officially became your dad? If you took my last name, if I could take care of you always, not just as an uncle or a friend, but as a real dad?" Emily was silent for a moment, processing. Then her eyes filled with tears and she jumped off her stool, running to hug Richard. "You're already my dad in my heart," she said in a tearful voice. "I always wanted a dad, and when you showed up I knew you were special. Yes, I want you to be my real dad. Can you? Really?" Richard hugged her tightly, his own tears finally falling. "Yes, I can, my daughter," he whispered. "Forever." Sarah joined the hug, and the three of them stood there, intertwined, forming a complete circle of love and belonging. In that moment, that little house with the green gate held more happiness than many palaces around the world. The following months were ones of profound and definitive transformations. Richard began the legal process to recognize Emily as his daughter. There were meetings with lawyers, endless paperwork, visits to the courthouse, but he did it all with a smile on his face, because every signature, every document, every step brought him closer to making official what his heart already knew to be true. Emily was his daughter, Sarah was his family, and nothing would ever change that. During this period, Richard began to completely reevaluate his life. The Upper East Side penthouse, once his solitary refuge, was now empty most of the time. He spent his nights at the house with the green gate, sleeping on the sofa after Emily went to bed, waking up to the smell of coffee made by Sarah, helping the girl get ready for school before he went to work. It was a simple routine, but it was the routine he wanted. It was the life he chose every day. New beginnings. Salon continued to thrive. Sarah had become a local fixture, known not only for the quality of her work, but for the warm way she treated every client. The salon was always busy, with appointments booked weeks in advance. The 2 employees she had hired were now 4, and there were plans to expand into the adjacent space that had just become available. What had started as a dream was becoming a solid, profitable business. But the money, Sarah discovered, wasn't the most important thing. Of course, financial stability was wonderful. Not having to count pennies at the end of the month was a huge relief, and being able to buy things for Emily without guilt was liberating. But the real treasure was in the little things, in family dinners, in shared laughter, in deep, late-night conversations, in the love that grew every day between her and Richard, a mature love built on a solid foundation of respect, trust, and mutual admiration. Emily was flourishing in ways Sarah had never thought possible. The girl had always been cheerful, but now there was a new security about her. At school performances, she was no longer the only child without a father in the audience. Richard was always there, clapping enthusiastically, recording videos, taking pictures, as proud as any biological father would be. On homework assignments that asked her to draw her family, Emily now drew 3 figures holding hands with enormous smiles. When classmates asked about her dad, she would proudly say he was the best dad in the world. The adoption process was finally completed on a clear December morning. At the courthouse before the judge, with Sarah and Emily by his side, Richard signed the documents that officially made him Emily's father. When the judge congratulated the new Miller family, Richard had to fight back tears. Emily, without any shame, cried openly with joy, hugging her mother. It was one of the most important moments of their lives, and they all knew it. They left the courthouse as a legally united family, but they had been a family for a long time where it really mattered, in their hearts. They went to celebrate at a pizza place Emily loved, a simple neighborhood spot where the waiters already knew them and always saved their corner table. It was a small celebration, without pomp, without luxury, but full of genuine joy. That night, after putting Emily to bed, Richard and Sarah sat on the small back porch of the house looking at the stars. Richard had something important to say, something he had been planning for weeks. "Sarah," he said, taking her hand, "today was one of the most important days of my life. We made official what already existed. We gave a name to the love I feel for Emily. But there's something else I want to make official, too." Sarah looked at him, her heart racing. Richard got off the bench where they were sitting and knelt in front of her. He didn't have a ring. He hadn't prepared a grand speech. There were no rose petals or violins. It was just him, her, and the naked truth of what they felt for each other. "Sarah," he continued, his voice thick with emotion, "you saved me when I was lost. You showed me there was still kindness in the world. You gave me a family when I had nothing but money and loneliness. You made me want to be a better man. I love you in a way I never knew it was possible to love. Will you marry me? Will you officially build this family we already have? Will you be my wife, my partner, my home forever?" Sarah was crying, but they were tears of pure happiness. "Yes," she answered without hesitation. "Yes, 1,000 times yes. I love you too, Richard. You completely changed our lives. You gave Emily the father she always deserved. You gave me a partner I thought I'd never find. Of course I'll marry you. Of course I want to spend the rest of my life with you." They kissed there, on the small porch, under the stars, sealing a promise they both knew they would keep. Not because they had to, but because they wanted to, because they had chosen each other, not out of need or self-interest, but out of true love. They decided to have a simple wedding with only close friends and family. Richard didn't want anything grand or extravagant. He had already lived in that world of appearances and had discovered it was empty. He wanted something meaningful, something real. Sarah completely agreed. They didn't need to prove anything to anyone. They just needed to celebrate their love with the people who truly mattered. The wedding took place 2 months later in a small neighborhood chapel. In attendance were the salon employees, some neighbors who had become friends, Sarah's old work colleagues, a few trusted executives from Richard's company, whom he considered true friends, and of course, Emily as the flower girl, in a white dress that made her look like a princess. Sarah was beautiful, in a simple but elegant dress she had chosen herself. It didn't cost a fortune, it wasn't designer, but it made her feel beautiful and special. Richard, in a discreet suit, couldn't stop smiling as he watched her walk down the aisle. This extraordinary woman had agreed to spend her entire life with him. It was more than he deserved, more than he had ever dared to dream. The vows were emotional. They spoke of a love built day by day, of a chosen family, of second chances, of new beginnings. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, Emily clapped so enthusiastically it made everyone laugh. Richard kissed Sarah, and then picked Emily up, kissing her forehead as well. "Now we're complete," he whispered to them both. "Now we're a real family in every possible way." The reception was held at the salon itself, specially decorated for the occasion. Simple but delicious food, lively music, lots of dancing, and laughter. Emily was the star of the party, dancing with everyone, pulling Richard and Sarah onto the dance floor, taking pictures with a disposable camera she had received as a gift. Richard danced with his wife, holding her close, still not quite believing this was real. That he, the man who had everything but had nothing, now truly had everything that mattered. During the party, one of Richard's executives pulled him aside. "Boss," he said, "can I ask you a personal question?" Richard nodded. "Don't you miss it? The life you had before, the lavish parties, the Michelin-starred restaurants, the private jet trips?" Richard looked around. He saw Sarah chatting animatedly with the neighbors. He saw Emily playing with other children, covered in cake but completely happy. He felt the warmth of this place filled with simple but genuine people, with true love, with real connections. He smiled and replied, "No, not for a second. That life was empty. This is real, and I wouldn't trade this reality for all the mansions and yachts in the world." The executive watched him for a moment and then smiled too. "You've changed a lot, boss, for the better," Richard agreed. "They changed me. They saved me from myself, and I'm eternally grateful for that." After the wedding, Richard made a decision that shocked the corporate world, but made perfect sense to him. He sold most of his companies, keeping only enough shares to ensure a comfortable income, but without the crushing responsibilities that consumed all his time. He sold the Upper East Side penthouse, the mansions around the world, the luxury cars. He kept only the essentials and invested the rest in funds that helped low-income families start their own businesses, just as he had helped Sarah. With more free time, Richard could finally live the life he had always wanted without knowing it. He woke up early to have breakfast with his family. He took Emily to school every day. He spent his mornings helping Sarah at the salon, not because he had to, but because he loved being near her, being part of her world. In the afternoons, he picked Emily up from school and helped her with her homework. In the evenings, they had dinner together, talked about their day, and watched movies cuddled on the sofa. It was an ordinary, common, unglamorous life, and it was absolutely perfect. The house with the green gate was renovated, not to become a mansion but to be more comfortable, an extra bedroom so Emily could have more space, an expanded kitchen where Sarah could try new recipes, a small library where Richard could read and Emily could do her homework, an improved backyard where they could have barbecues on weekends. They kept the simplicity because that's what made them happy, but they added comfort because they deserved it. Emily grew up surrounded by love. She didn't have everything money could buy, but she had something far more valuable. She had present parents who listened to her, who were interested in her life, who attended every school performance, every game, every important moment. She had emotional security. She knew she was loved unconditionally, that she would never be abandoned. She grew up confident, kind, empathetic, learning from her parents' example that a person's true worth isn't in what they have, but in who they are. Richard discovered talents he never knew he had. He learned to cook simple dishes that made Sarah and Emily smile with satisfaction. He learned to fix things around the house, feeling proud when he could replace a faucet or paint a wall. He learned to play, something he had never done even as a child. He built Lego castles with Emily, played video games poorly but with enthusiasm, and assembled giant jigsaw puzzles that took over the living room table for days. Sarah changed too, not just on the outside, though she was more beautiful and radiant than ever, but on the inside. The woman who had always carried the weight of the world on her shoulders, who never rested, who never allowed herself to dream too big, now knew she could relax. She had a true partner, someone who shared responsibilities, who was there in good times and bad. She could finally allow herself to be happy without fear that everything would suddenly fall apart. New beginnings. Salon expanded into the space next door, doubling in size. Sarah hired more employees, all of them single mothers or women in difficult situations who needed an opportunity. She offered fair wages, flexible hours, and a work environment where they felt respected and valued. The salon became not just a business but a community, a place where women supported each other, shared stories, and found strength. Richard watched, it all with pride. Sarah was a natural leader, a born entrepreneur, someone who was building something genuinely valuable. Not just financially valuable, but socially, emotionally. The salon was changing lives, just as it had changed hers and his. On an ordinary evening, about 2 years after the wedding, the three of them were in the living room watching a movie. Emily, now almost 10, was leaning against Richard's lap, fighting off sleep. Sarah was beside him, her head resting on his shoulder. The movie wasn't particularly interesting, but none of them wanted the moment to end. It was a moment of absolute peace, of deep contentment, of complete belonging. Emily finally gave in to sleep. Richard adjusted her in his arms, stood up carefully, and carried her to her room. He tucked her in, kissed her forehead, and stood there for a moment, just watching his daughter sleep. His daughter. The word still filled him with emotion even after all this time. This incredible, kind, intelligent, loving girl was his daughter, and he was her father. He had been chosen for this role, and every day he worked to deserve it. He returned to the living room where Sarah was waiting. She was standing now looking out the window at the quiet street. Richard came up behind her and wrapped her in his arms. She leaned back against him, sighing contentedly. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. Sarah turned to face him. "I was thinking about how strange life is," she answered, "how everything can change so quickly. 3 years ago, I was struggling alone, barely surviving, with no hope that things could get better. And then you showed up, a stranger in a diner, and everything changed. Not overnight, but little by little, day by day, until suddenly I look around and I don't recognize my life anymore. But in a good way, in the best possible way." Richard smiled and kissed her forehead. "I was lost too," he said. "Rich but miserable, successful but empty, surrounded by luxury but completely alone. And then you and Emily showed me what I was missing. You showed me that true wealth isn't in bank accounts, but in moments like this, in love, in family, in belonging. You saved me, Sarah. You gave me a reason to live, not just to exist." Sarah hugged him tightly. "We saved each other," she whispered. "You gave us stability, opportunities, security. But more than that, you gave us love, presence, commitment. Emily has the father she always dreamed of. I have the partner I never thought I'd find. We're a real family." They held each other there for a long time in silence, just feeling each other's presence. They didn't need words. The love between them was evident in every gesture, every look, every shared moment. Richard thought about everything he had been through to get here. Jessica's betrayal, which at the time had seemed like the end of the world, but which he now realized had been a disguised new beginning. The 3 years of loneliness, which had prepared him to value what he had now. The night at the diner, when he decided to test humanity and ended up finding so much more than he expected. Every step of the way, no matter how painful, had led him here, to this house, this family, this life, and he realized something fundamental. He had spent decades accumulating wealth, building an empire, proving his worth to the world. But the world didn't care. The numbers didn't fill the void. Professional success didn't warm the cold nights. What truly mattered, what gave life meaning, what made it all worthwhile, was right here in this simple house. It was in Emily's smile. It was in Sarah's embrace. It was in the dinners at the table. It was in the late-night talks. It was in the love built day by day, brick by brick, moment by moment. Sarah interrupted his thoughts. "You know what I find most incredible about all this?" she asked. Richard looked at her quizzically. "It's that we didn't meet under normal circumstances. You could have walked into that diner as the billionaire businessman you are, and I would have treated you with the deference rich people usually receive. and everything would have been different. But you came in as an ordinary, vulnerable, lonely man. And I saw your humanity before I saw your money. That made all the difference. Richard agreed. You're right. If things had been different, we might never have built what we have. You never would have offered me food if I was wearing an expensive suit and a designer watch. And I never would have seen your true kindness if you were trying to impress me. We both had to strip away our defenses, our masks, so we could truly find each other. Sarah smiled. Fate has its mysterious ways, doesn't it? Richard pulled her closer. It certainly does, and I'm eternally grateful for the path that led me to you and Emily. That night, lying in bed next to Sarah, listening to her soft breathing as she slept, Richard reflected on everything. On the man he had been, closed off, bitter, suspicious. On the man he was now, open, happy, grateful. On the journey that had completely transformed him. He remembered the words he had said to Sarah the day they first saw the salon. Now I have everything, and she had replied, we have everything. And they really did. Not in a material sense, although they wanted for nothing, but in the sense that truly mattered. They had love, they had family, they had purpose, they had belonging, they had a home. The man who had everything but had nothing had finally found what truly mattered. And it wasn't money, it wasn't power, it wasn't status. It was genuine human connection. It was being loved not for what he had but for who he was. It was waking up every day knowing there were people in the world who truly cared about him, who would stand by him not in moments of glory, but especially in moments of hardship. Richard whispered into the darkness, to Sarah sleeping beside him, to Emily dreaming in the next room, to the universe that had conspired to bring them together. Thank you. For everything. For every moment. For every challenge that brought me here. For this incredible family. For this true love. For this simple but absolutely extraordinary life. And there, in that house with the gate that was now painted, fair soft blue in a humble neighborhood in Queens, slept the richest family any fortune could buy. Rich in love, in connection, in truth. Rich in shared moments, sincere laughter, and comforting hugs. Rich in everything that truly mattered on the journey called life. The billionaire businessman who had disguised himself as an ordinary man to test humanity had found much more than he expected. He had found his own humanity, lost for so long. He had found genuine kindness in a world he believed was governed only by selfishness. He had found true love where he least expected it. And he had found himself, the most authentic and happy version of himself, reflected in the eyes of an extraordinary woman and a wonderful girl who had chosen him just as he had chosen them. The story that had begun with skepticism and distrust ended with hope and certainty. The certainty that kindness still existed in the world, the certainty that true love was possible, the certainty that family wasn't defined by blood, but by choice, commitment, and daily devotion, the certainty that the true meaning of home wasn't in the walls of mansions, but in hearts that beat in sync, united by the invisible but unbreakable thread of genuine love. And so, under the starry New York sky, in the simplicity of an ordinary house, lived the proof that miracles still happen when we open ourselves to them. That second chances exist for those who have the courage to start over. That true love knows no social class, measures no assets, calculates no advantages. It simply happens, transforms, heals, and fills every empty space with light and hope. Richard Miller had learned the most important lesson of his life. He had learned that what he was desperately searching for was exactly where he never thought to look, in simple people, in selfless gestures, in kindness that expects no reward, in a love built brick by brick, day by day, choice by choice. And having learned that lesson, he had finally found what we all seek, consciously or unconsciously, throughout our entire existence. He had found his place in the world. He had found where he belonged. He had found his home.